Hello and welcome to the Biology 6 Respiratory System Lecture, Part 1. Before we jump into the respiratory system, let me first briefly review the two loops of the cardiovascular system.
So if that's the heart there, and these are the lungs, there's a part of the cardiovascular system called the pulmonary loop, where the blood comes out of the right ventricle of the heart, goes to the lungs, and then returns to the left atrium of the heart. Like that. That is the pulmonary loop. The word pulmonary means lungs, and so I guess the name makes sense. And then there's also what's called the systemic loop. The blood begins the systemic loop by getting pumped out of the left ventricle of the heart into the aorta. Well, this side of the diagram is the systemic loop. And eventually it does return back to the heart in the inferior and superior vena cava. There's so much for my sense of balance today. Okay, yeah, and the pulmonary loop goes from the heart to the lungs and back, but the systemic loop comes out of the heart and goes everywhere in the body, to all your muscles and your brain and your nervous tissue and your skin, your digestive organs. The systemic loop goes to all the organs in the body other than the lungs and then back to the heart. And these little circles with the dots represent all the trillions of cells in your body. Well, the reason why I'm illustrating all this is to talk about the movement of oxygen gas and carbon dioxide gas. So remember that all of your cells use a certain oxygen-using process to make energy for themselves, and that process is called cellular aerobic respiration. Good. And yeah, to do this cellular aerobic respiration process, the cells require oxygen, and they get that from the blood. They also require glucose, which they also get from the blood, but we're going to be focusing mostly on the gases today, so let's focus in on the oxygen. Good. So the cells get their oxygen from the blood. They do this cellular aerobic respiration process to make energy for themselves. And as a waste product from that cellular aerobic respiration process, the cells make another gas called carbon dioxide, which they put into the blood to get rid of. Well, so since the cells are constantly getting oxygen out of the blood has to replenish its oxygen supply, otherwise it would just run out. And that's where the pulmonary loop comes in. And one of the things that goes on in the pulmonary loop is that oxygen from the air in the lungs goes into the blood. And so that oxygen-rich blood eventually flows back to the left side of the heart, the left atrium and the left ventricle, and then it gets pumped into the systemic loop, and that's where those arteries in the systemic loop get their oxygen to give to the cells. And the carbon dioxide that the cells make as this waste product from aerobic respiration, that goes into the blood and eventually returns to the right side of the heart, to the right atrium and then right ventricle. And then the right ventricle pumps it into the pulmonary loop. Well, the blood has to get rid of that carbon dioxide, otherwise it would just become too saturated with it. And so that's also what goes on in the lungs. The carbon dioxide exits the blood there in the pulmonary loop and goes into the lungs, and what happens to it from there? Well, you get rid of it. It's a waste product. The body doesn't want it, and so every time you expire, you breathe out, you're getting rid of CO2 that just exited your blood. Okay, so bear this all in mind. It relates to what we're going to be talking about today. Let me turn down the lights a little bit. Pardon me one sec. All right. So we're starting in today on the respiratory system, and as you can see there, I defined it as the organ system that exchanges gases between the air in the lungs and the blood. And more specifically, it's right here. The gas exchange is the oxygen going into the blood and the carbon dioxide coming out of the blood. That's the gas exchange in the lungs that we're talking about. Now, here in my diagram, it looks like the left lung is putting oxygen in and the right lung is taking CO2 out of the blood. That's just fictitious because I got a little bit lazy. In both parts of the lungs, oxygen is going into the blood, and in both parts of the lungs, CO2 is coming out of the blood. All right, so that's what's going on in your respiratory system. Gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood, and what's going on is oxygen is entering the blood so that the blood has oxygen to give to your cells, and CO2 is exiting the blood to get rid of that carbon dioxide that the cells have made. Okay, well, so the respiratory organ system actually has several organs that are part of it, but they subdivide those organs into two groups. One group of those organs of the respiratory system are the lungs themselves, which they're showing in this pink color here. So that's where the actual gas exchange between the blood and the air in the lungs takes place in the lungs. And the other organs of the respiratory system are what are called the airway passages, or just the airways for short. And these are the tubes that connect the outside air, the atmospheric air, to the lungs. In other words, the airways are what bring the air in and out of the lungs so that the gas exchange can take place. The airway passages are sometimes called the respiratory tract, but usually I just call them the airways. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we'll go through these various organs of the respiratory system and talk about where they're located and what their functions are, and we'll start in with the airways. All right, airways, they are the passageways that carry air in and out of the lungs, and that's their main function, just to be basically tubes that bring the air, the atmospheric air, in and out of the lungs. But they have a couple of other features also, functions also. The airways also warm the air as it's coming in, and that's pretty straightforward. The airways have a lot of blood vessels in their walls, and your blood carries your body heat, and so as that air is traveling through the airways, the blood in those blood vessels just naturally warms the air. Another function of the airways is to clean the air, to clean it up before it reaches the lungs. And we don't normally think of the air as being dirty. I mean, looking around the room right here, it looks like the air is perfectly clear, but actually it's not. There are very, very small particles suspended in the air all the time. You just normally are not aware of them. What are these things? Well, some of it is just dust, like microscopic bits of dirt. Other bits of it are tree pollen, and there's some potentially dangerous stuff that's also part of the particle matters in the air. For example, bacterial spores, essentially bacterial eggs, if you want to think of it that way, are floating around in the air all the time. And so all that particulate matter in the air could potentially be dangerous if it reaches your lungs. And so what I'm saying is one of the jobs of the airways is also to clean the air as it's heading down towards the lungs. And let me show you how that works. It's kind of interesting. So let's look at one of these airway passages. Imagine that we're going to zoom in on this airway right here in this next slide. There it is. And so here's the lumen, here's the hollow space of that airway right there. And here in yellow you can see some of the epithelial cells that make up the lining of that airway. Well, so if you look closely, there's kind of a clearish looking layer that coats the surface of the cells, there on this side and there on that side. Well, what that stuff is a sticky mucus. And its job is to trap the air, the particles in the air before they reach the lungs. And so it works on what I call the flypaper principle. I guess if you have a lot of flies in your house, you can buy this sticky flypaper, you put it around the house, and then when the flies land on it, they get stuck, and that gets rid of the flies for you. Same principle here. When you breathe in air, the particles in the air, the dust and other things in the air, kind of eddy and swirl around as they're coming down your airways, and then eventually they'll just get stuck in the mucus before they reach the lungs, and therefore the air that reaches the lungs is clean air. or I should say cleaner air, because it's not 100% effective. There are some dust particles in the air which simply miss the mucus. They're lucky enough to avoid the mucus. And so, yeah, you do get some particles that do reach your lungs, but the point is you'd have a lot more particles reaching your lungs if you didn't have this layer of mucus coating your airways. Well, once these particles get trapped in this sticky mucus of the airways, the particles have to be moved upward away from the lungs. Otherwise, the particles would just keep getting stuck here, and eventually, I don't know, you get too many particles there, and that wouldn't be healthy. Well, if you look closely at these epithelial cells that make up the wall of the airway, they have those little hair-like extensions called cilia, and those cilia are constantly slowly pushing upward on the mucus. So there's a slow, constant upward flow of the mucus away from the lungs that carries those trapped particles, Gesundheit, that carry those trapped particles upward away from the lungs, and so they rise higher and higher and higher. And what happens to them? Well, eventually they reach the top of this airway passage here, and you can see right here it connects to another passage. That's called your esophagus, and it leads down to your stomach. And so what essentially happens is the mucus that has those trapped particles just gets dumped down to the esophagus. It goes to your stomach, and your stomach acids digest it to get rid of it. I mean, it sounds kind of gross, but you're just constantly swallowing your mucus all day long as a way of getting rid of it. I was going to try to Google around on the internet to see if I can see how many liters of mucus we swallow each day. It's kind of a gross fact, but I couldn't find the number, but I'm sure it would be quite a lot of mucus if you added it up over the course of a day. Boy, and especially when we get sick. My kid has a cold right now, and she's probably making 5 liters of mucus a day or something like that. Okay, well, so anyway, yeah, that's the idea of these airways. They are just tubes that connect the lungs to the atmospheric air, and their main job is just to bring the air in and out, but they also clean the air and warm the air as it's moving in. All right, well, before we get to the lungs, I want to go through the airways in a little bit more detail and start actually naming some of the names of these airways. All right. Well, usually when we breathe in, the first area it goes through is into your nose, and the hollow space inside the nose is called the nasal cavity, and so that's the first of your airways. Now, sure, occasionally we do breathe through our mouth. For instance, if you're exercising, you usually breathe through your mouth, but typically it's your nasal cavity is the first airway. Here's a close-up of that. As you could imagine, the sense of smell is located inside your nasal cavity. There are sensory receptors in the roof of your nasal cavity that sample whatever molecules are dissolved in the air, and that's what gives you your sense of smell. All right, well, so that's the first of the airways, the nasal cavity. The next spot the air flows into is this area right here, which is called the pharynx. Actually, I think I need to click on my computer to put some labels there. Okay, sure, there's the nasal cavity. Well, yeah, the next area that the air goes is this area right here. That's called the pharynx. You can think of the pharynx as the upper part of your throat. It's the part of your throat that is behind the nasal cavity and also behind your oral cavity. Now, the pharynx doesn't carry just air, it also carries food and water. You know, when you're eating or drinking something and you swallow it, it also ends up there in the pharynx. All right, then the pharynx, well, we're focusing on the air, so the pharynx carries the air downward, and then that's the official end of the pharynx right there, but what actually happens is it splits into 2 tubes, each with their own name. This one that's more anterior, more towards the front of your throat, that's your trachea, which is your windpipe. That's the one that will carry the air downward towards the lungs. What's the other one, the one in back there? That's called your esophagus. Do I have that there? There it is. And it's not an airway. That leads down to your stomach. I guess I mentioned that a few minutes ago, that as the mucus comes upward, it gets carried up to the top of the trachea here, and then the mucus kind of gets dumped downward into your esophagus and goes to your stomach, and you digest it. But anyway, so the esophagus is not an airway, it's part of your digestive system, and that's why I gave it kind of a different coloration there. Okay, now, so like I said, the pharynx is not just for air, it also carries food and water. Well, the food and water need to go down into the esophagus so they can be digested. And you don't want the food and water going down in your trachea, because then you would end up choking. And so how does your airways handle that? How does your airways ensure that the food and water go down the esophagus and the air goes down the trachea? Well, thanks to this little thing right there, that almost like finger-like thing sticking out there is called your epiglottis. It's a cartilage flap that, when you swallow, can fold down, and it blocks off the top of your trachea. And so that makes sure that when you're swallowing, the food and the water go down the esophagus where they're supposed to go. And as soon as the food and water have passed, then the epiglottis flips back up again, and you're breathing again. It usually happens so quickly that you don't even notice that you've stopped breathing for just a part of a second when you're swallowing your food and water. And I think I have sort of a cartoon of that. Here's something that the guy's swallowing. It looks almost like a Snickers bar. I guess that's kind of Halloween-like, right? And so, yeah, when he's swallowing it, you can see the epiglottis has folded downward to block off his trachea, ensuring that the food goes down into the esophagus. But as soon as that food is passed, watch the epiglottis flips back up again, and the guy's breathing. Then he swallows again, flips downward, make sure the food goes to the stomach, and then it's passed, and so now it flips upward again. Then he takes another bite, flips downward, that slides past, and it's upward again, and now he's breathing again. The only time it doesn't work right is if you're trying to hold a conversation while you're eating. And I'm sure we've all done this before. You're getting so excited and blah, blah, blah. Guess what happened at school today? Mr. Eden said this, blah, 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 blah. And you get so excited talking that you do end up kind of overriding this reflex, and you end up choking on it. That's what I was going to say. Yeah. The epiglottis movement is built in as a reflex, but if you just are dead set on talking while you're eating, you can override that reflex, and then you do end up choking on your food or your drink. Okay, this epiglottis is this cartilage structure that's here at the very top of the trachea. There's actually a few other cartilage structures that are in that area right there at the top of the trachea also. And as a group, all those cartilage structures there are called your larynx, which is sometimes also known as your voice box. It's a hollow cartilage, or I should say they're a group of cartilage structures right at the junction of the trachea and the pharynx. And we've talked about this part of the larynx already, the epiglottis, that make sure you don't choke on your food. Also part of your larynx are the vocal cords, and I think that's what these are in the diagram right here. Those are folds of tissue. Part of them are cartilage, but there's also some non-cartilage tissue, and they vibrate when you speak, and they are what allow you to make noises when you speak. Just like a vibrating guitar string makes a noise, your vibrating vocal cords, when they vibrate, make noises, and that's what allow you to speak, to make noises. Another part of this larynx are some cartilage pieces that you see right here. That is called, actually before I finish with the vocal cords, there's this male hormone testosterone, and one of its effects is it makes the vocal cords thicker, and that's why males tend to have deeper voices than females do. Okay, well, there's yet another piece of cartilage which is also part of the larynx. This one right here, that's called the thyroid cartilage, and it's the Adam's apple, basically. If you look at someone's throat, you see sort of a bump right there. That's their Adam's apple. It's also made larger by testosterone, and so for that reason, males tend to have more prominent Adam's apples than females do. Females definitely do have them. They do have a thyroid cartilage, but it tends to be smaller in females. All right, well, let's see. All right, well then, let's maybe a recap. So in the airways so far, we have the nasal cavity, then the pharynx, and then the trachea. Remember, the top of the trachea is a bunch of cartilage structures that as a group are called the larynx. And then the trachea carries the air on downward into the thoracic cavity. And then about this spot in the thoracic cavity, about at the level of the sternum, that's the end of the trachea, but it doesn't just come to a dead end. What it actually does is splits into two lateral airways that are called the primary bronchi. And so this right here is her right primary bronchus, and this right here is her left primary bronchus. And what those primary bronchi do is they carry the air into each lung. Let's see, left and right primary bronchi, tubes formed by the branching of the trachea. Yeah, and each bronchus enters one lung, carries the air into one lung. And you can kind of see that right there. There's the left bronchus going into the left lung and the right bronchus carrying the air into the right lung. All right, well, we're not quite done with the bronchi yet. We'll come back to them in a minute. But I do want to switch over to the lungs for a moment since we've kind of arrived at the lungs. All right, so I define the lungs here as two spongy and elastic organs in the thoracic cavity that draw in air and exchange gases with the blood. So let's see, where should I begin with that? So the lungs are definitely in your thoracic cavity. What other major organ is in there? Your heart. Yeah, those are the major organs of your thoracic cavity. The heart kind of in the center, and your lungs, your left lung and your right lung. Okay, so I described the lungs as spongy and elastic organs. The spongy part means full of tiny little round holes. If you think of looking at a kitchen sponge, one of its most prominent features is that it has those tiny little round holes all over it. That's the way the lungs are. And just looking at them, you may say, well, I don't see any round little holes. Well, the holes are microscopic. If you look at some lung tissue under a microscope, it looks exactly like a sponge, just millions and millions of little holes. And we'll talk about those holes later on. They're called alveoli, little round air sacs. Okay, so they are spongy and they are also elastic organs. And what I mean by that is they're stretchable, as if they were made out of rubber. The lungs stretch to a larger size. They have to, because when you breathe in, they need more space for their air. So when she breathes in, each lung stretches to a larger size, and when she breathes out, the lung recoils to a smaller size. Like that. And so, so when you think of the lungs, think of them as spongy, but also think of them as very stretchable, rubbery. They are elastic organs. All right, well, let's get back to the airways for a second. So in each lung, it was the primary bronchus that brought the air into that lung. As soon as each bronchus enters a lung, that bronchus starts branching into smaller bronchi. And those smaller bronchi then branch into smaller bronchi, and those smaller bronchi branch into even smaller and smaller bronchi. And so it's a lot like a tree. If you turn your head sideways, each bronchus is like the main trunk of the tree that comes out of the ground. And if you look at a real tree, then that trunk has some branchings, and then those branchings have branchings, and those branchings and branchings and branchings have branchings. You get smaller and smaller branches the further you go outward from the trunk of the tree. That's exactly the way these bronchi work in the lungs. They get smaller and smaller and smaller. Here's a close-up of her left lung showing that branching of the bronchi. And I think the next is a photograph. There it is, kind of a neat photograph. Somehow they stripped off everything in the lungs except all the bronchi, but you can really see how tiny they get as they get smaller and smaller, deeper into the lungs. Now, I made an analogy with a tree a minute ago, where each primary bronchus was like the trunk of the tree, and then you had more branchings and more branchings. In a tree, the smallest, tiniest branches at the very tips have a special name. We call those the twigs. Well, in the lungs, the tiniest bronchi at the very tips there have a special name. They're called bronchioles. And did I define that? There, the bronchioles are the smallest branchings of the bronchi in the lungs. The tiniest little bronchial passages are the bronchioles. Now, a while back, I got to wondering, well, exactly how many bronchioles do you have in each lung? And you don't have to know this number, but I looked it up on the internet, and it turns out 30,000 bronchioles in each lung. Okay, well, so imagine that we're going to zoom in on just one of those bronchioles. Well, actually, this kind of shows it here. If you were to zoom in on just one of those bronchioles, you would see that there are a cluster of those round air sacs at its tip. So let's see. Looks like here's one bronchiole right here, and yeah, it terminates in a bunch of round air sacs, which are called alveoli. And you can see the same thing here. Here's a bronchiole, and it ends with a bunch of round air sacs, and we call those alveoli. And same here. Here's a bronchiole, and here's the alveoli at its end. So each bronchiole at its very end opens up into a cluster of round air sacs, which we call alveoli. And here's my cartoon of it. There's a bronchiole with its alveoli. There's a bronchiole with its alveoli, and there's a bronchiole with its alveoli. So it's kind of like a bunch of grapes. If you go down to the grocery store, a bunch of grapes, the grapes are the round things, but the whole bunch of grapes is connected to that stem in the middle of the grape bunch. So think of the bronchiole as the stem. Well, these alveoli are just round, hollow air sacs, and they are important. They are where the actual gas exchange with the blood occurs. So when you inspire, when you breathe in, the air flows downward through all those airways that we talked about, and these bronchioles are the last of the airways. There it is. But the air in the bronchioles doesn't just end there. The air fills up in the bronchioles, flows into these alveoli and fills them up. And then when you expire, when you breathe out, as we'll see here in a second, the air flows out of these alveoli into the bronchioles and then into the bronchi and eventually back out of your nose. All right. Well, I think the next slide is kind of a close-up of, there we go. So yeah, so there's one bronchiole right there, and here are these alveoli that are clustered around its end. And I guess I mentioned a few minutes ago, so if you look at the lungs under the microscope, it does look like a bunch of round open spaces like a sponge. That's why, because most of the space in the lungs is made out of these alveoli. All right, well, so remember the whole point of all this, at least one of the major points, is to put oxygen into the blood. And so there are a lot of capillaries, these tiniest blood vessels, all over the surface of all these alveoli so that the gas exchange can take place. Now, a quick review question. These capillaries are part of which loop? Pulmonary, right, because it's blood flow to the lungs here, and so it has to be part of the pulmonary loop. Yeah, these are pulmonary capillaries. And here's the textbook's illustration of exactly that. There's the bronchiole, here's the cluster of alveoli, and here's the air coming in these blood vessels right here, and then the air picks up oxygen as it's flowing through these blood vessels on the surface of the alveoli, and now the oxygen-rich blood flows away now that it's picked up the oxygen. Notice the color change, because remember that oxygen-rich blood is bright red in color, and low oxygen blood is blue in color, and so yeah, this blood that's flowing in here is low oxygen, and then as it flows through these capillaries and picks up oxygen from the alveoli, it gets this nice, bright, oxygen-rich red color as it flows away from the alveoli. And here's yet another figure I stole from your textbook showing the exact same thing. You can see all these capillaries on the surface of this alveolus. And the color changes as the air picks up the oxygen. Or I should say as the blood picks up the oxygen. All right, well, this is Yet another illustration of the same concept. I guess I got a little carried away here, but this actually shows some detail that I didn't mention in the last one. So this is an alveolus. So this is one of these hollow air sacs, and if you could look closely, you see the wall of it is made out of tissue. Well, since this is a hollow structure, what type of tissue does that have to be? Epithelial. Any hollow structure in the body, always the inner lining has to be epithelial tissue. Yeah, so the wall of each alveolus is epithelial tissue, but looking at it more closely, what type of epithelial tissue is it? Simple squamous, very good, exactly. And it's simple squamous for a reason. That's the thinnest type of tissue there is. Remember, simple means just one cell layer thick, and squamous means these flattened epithelial cells. And so that's about as thin a wall as you can make is simple squamous epithelial tissue. All right, well, remember that each alveolus has those capillaries on its surface. So I'll just show one capillary to keep the illustration simple. Well, capillaries also have a wall made out of just one cell layer, simple epithelial tissue. You might recall that's called the tunica interna of the blood vessel. Yeah, so capillaries only have a tunica interna. And so notice that there's not much of a barrier between the air in the lungs and the blood in these pulmonary capillaries. It's just basically two cells thick, one layer of epithelial cells that form the wall of the alveolus, and one layer of epithelial cells that form the wall of the capillary. And so that's not much of a barrier separating your blood from the air in the alveolus. And so given how thin that is, it's very easy for the gases to diffuse between the blood in the capillaries and the air inside the alveoli. So here's some oxygen. When you inspire, passes very easily through those, just two layers of cells and then off into the blood. And here's the carbon dioxide. Where's the carbon dioxide? Come on. Oh, this just shows that there was that color change, of course, as the blood gets oxygen, it becomes red colored. But you know that. Here's the CO2. And remember, the blood has to get rid of the CO2. And same thing, it's such a thin layer that the CO2 easily passes through, diffuses through, and then when you expire, you're getting rid of that CO2. And of course, it's all happening simultaneously. The oxygen is diffusing into your blood, and the CO2 is diffusing out of the blood. Well, if there's a bad side to the fact that this is such a thin membrane, well, it's actually, the good side is that it makes the gas exchange very easy because it's such a thin membrane. If there's a bad side to it, it's so thin that sometimes liquids can leak across and get inside your lung. Water from the blood can get inside your lungs. It doesn't happen often, but if a person has poor circulation, in other words, if the blood is circulating more slowly than it's supposed to, because the blood spends extra time, if it's circulating more slowly, that gives more of a chance for water to leak out. When we talked about the cardiovascular system, was it last week? I talked about a disorder called congestive heart failure, where the heart has essentially worn itself out pumping against high blood pressure for decades and decades. Well, that's the congestive part. If a person has congestive heart failure, their heart is too weak to pump the blood at normal levels, and so the blood circulates more slowly, and therefore people with congestive heart failure have water from the blood leaking into their lungs, and so they have congestion all the time. They're coughing all the time. All right, now I think these are just kind of some review slides. There you see all these capillaries on the surface of all the alveoli to pick up oxygen from the air that's in there, and each bronchiole has its own cluster of alveoli. You know that. And there's the lungs with their tens of thousands of bronchioles inside each lung. Oh, and this is what I was describing to you, that if you look at lung tissue under the microscope, it looks spongy because those are the alveoli. Each of those is one alveolus. And if you look closely, you can see the simple epithelial tissue that makes it the wall of each alveolus. This is supposed to be a diagram pretty similar to what I showed on the board at the beginning. All right, so there's the pulmonary loop up on top where the blood comes out of the right side of the heart and goes to the lungs and comes back to the left atrium. And here's the systemic loop down there at the bottom, where the blood comes out of the left ventricle of the heart and goes into the aorta, and then goes all the way to all the organs of your body other than your lungs, and then in these vena cava returns to the right atrium of the heart. And this I just made this cartoon to recap the idea about the gases. The oxygen flows in as the blood flows through the pulmonary loop, and so you have high oxygen blood, this red blood, in the pulmonary veins, in the in the left atrium, left ventricle, in the aorta, and these first arteries of the systemic loop. But as those arteries of the systemic loop pass through the various tissues of your various organs, the oxygen leaves the blood and goes to the cells so they can do their cellular aerobic respiration. And so now you have low oxygen blood in the veins of the systemic loop, and therefore you have low oxygen blood in the right atrium, the right ventricle, and in the pulmonary arteries. But when that low oxygen blood in the pulmonary arteries flows past those capillaries on the surface of the alveoli, the oxygen gets replenished, and now you're back to the beginning here again with the high oxygen blood. And of course, the CO2 is kind of doing the opposite thing. The CO2 enters the blood when the cells are doing their aerobic respiration down here in the systemic loop, and so this low oxygen blood here in the systemic veins is also high CO2. So it's high CO2 in the right atrium, right ventricle, and in the pulmonary arteries, and then that carbon dioxide diffuses out of it when it reaches the alveoli of the lungs, and then you get rid of the CO2 when you breathe out. Okay, so, well, I kept saying I'm going to talk about how the air flows in and out of the lungs. Let's talk about that now. Here's the basic idea, that the lungs are elastic in nature, meaning that they're rubber-like. They can be stretched to a larger and smaller size, which kind of makes sense because when you breathe, you're taking in air, and so your lungs need to be able to stretch to a larger size. Let's see if I can get this to work the way I want it to. So here's my rubber band model of the lungs. Yeah, when you breathe in, the lungs get enlarged, and when you breathe out, the lungs get smaller. Well, that's related to how the air flows into your lungs. If you have a container with some air in it, so think of the lungs as a container, so to speak, if you make that container larger, the air gets more spread out in there, and that is going to reduce the air pressure in there. One of the things that controls air pressure is how spread out the air molecules are. So sure, if your lungs get stretched to a larger size, that lowers the air pressure in there. And that's going to make the air flow in from the outside, because there's this law of physics. If you have two areas of air, low pressure air here and high pressure air there, the high pressure air will just automatically flow to the lower pressure area. I guess the lower pressure is like a partial vacuum, and gases just automatically flow to wherever there's a vacuum or even a partial vacuum. And so that's the physical basis of how you breathe in air. You stretch your lungs to a larger size, that lowers the air pressure, and then air just naturally flows in through your airways to fill that lower pressure zone inside your lungs. So to breathe in, it's all about making your lungs larger. And how does that happen? Well, that's those inspiratory muscles that are in your lecture handout. I define them as muscles that expand. I said expand the thoracic cavity for inspiration. I really should have said just make the lungs bigger, expand the lungs. I don't know why I just said thoracic cavity. Okay, well, there's actually a couple of different sets of muscles that do that make your lungs larger to lower the air pressure in there so that the air will flow in. One of these muscles is called the diaphragm muscle. It's one of your inspiratory muscles. And as you can see from the cartoon here, there it is. It's kind of shaped like an upside-down bowl, and it's situated right below the lungs. And here's how it stretches the lungs to a larger size. I think I have a different cartoon. Here we go. When you are relaxing your diaphragm muscle, it's kind of higher in your abdominal cavity like that. When you contract it, it flattens out. In other words, it pulls itself downward. Instead of being like an upside-down bowl, it's more like an upside-down dish. And here you see that. There it is contracted. Well, notice what that does. It pulls the bottom of the lungs downward, and that stretches the lungs to a larger size. Let me reverse the cartoon here. So you relax your diaphragm, it's higher so the lungs are smaller, but when you contract your diaphragm, it pulls downward on the bottom of the lungs, which stretches them to a larger size, which lowers the air pressure, and that sucks in the air. Does that sound good? All right. So let's see. Breathing out, relax the diaphragm. Breathing in, contract the diaphragm. Sounds like Darth Vader. I am your father. Like that. All right, so I guess the major point is your diaphragm is one of your inspiratory muscles, and yeah, it does it by stretching the lungs to a larger size. Well, there's another group of muscles that are also inspiratory muscles. This other group is between the ribs. They are called your external intercostal muscles. Intercostal means between the ribs, and you can see them, well, you can see them all between those pairs of ribs. So in a way, they work just like the diaphragm in the sense that their job is to stretch the lungs to a larger size, to lower the air pressure, and that sucks in the air. But you remember the diaphragm worked by pulling down on the bottom of the lungs. The external intercostals do the opposite. They pull upward on the top of the lungs. When you contract those external intercostal muscles, your whole rib cage, including the lungs which are inside your rib cage, shifts upward slightly, and that stretches the lungs to a larger size. I guess I don't really have the cartoon here, but we saw this one before. There's the diaphragm going up and down, but just imagine those external intercostals. When the diaphragm is pulling downward on the bottom of the lungs, the external intercostals are pulling upward on the top, so you get a really big increase in the lungs volume, and that pulls in the air. Like that. All righty, well, so your lungs are constantly, thanks to these inspiratory muscles, your lungs are constantly getting stretched to a larger size to when you want to breathe in. How do you breathe out? Well, you don't need to contract any muscles to breathe out because the lungs are elastic. They automatically want to go back to their smaller size. Like with this rubber band, yes, I have to use some muscular force to stretch it to a larger size, but all I need to do is relax my muscles, and the rubber band will automatically snap itself back to the smaller size. The official term for that is elastic recoil. Whenever you have to stretch something to a larger size, if you just relax, it snaps back. That's elastic recoil. So what I'm saying is, thanks to this elastic recoil of your lungs, you don't have to use any muscle contraction to breathe out. You just relax those muscles. And here's kind of a morbid thought. So your last breath in this world will be an expiration, because when you die, you can't contract your muscles anymore. And so you'll just do one last relaxation. Your lungs will go small for the last time, and that will be your last breath and expiration. Yeah, so when you expire, you will expire is a good way to remember that. Okay, so the lungs are constantly stretching to a larger size when you inspire, and then they do elastic recoil to go back to a smaller size when you expire. If there was nothing that could provide lubrication for that stretching and contracting that the lungs are constantly doing, your breathing would be painful, because your lungs would be essentially scraping against the inside of your thoracic cavity. Well, to help the lungs expand and contract without scraping themselves on the inside of the thoracic cavity, your lungs have a fluid-filled membrane around them called the pleura. In this cartoon, this blue area right here is the pleura, and the pink area are the lungs. Now, of course, the thing in the middle is the heart, just to remind you that the heart is also there inside the thoracic cavity. And this pleura that surrounds the lungs is a type of membrane called a serosa. These serosas are fluid-filled membranes that surround and protect and cushion different organ types in your body. If you want to picture them, think of a plastic sealable baggie filled with water. That makes a nice fluid-filled double membrane that you could use to cushion things. Like I got a chicken breast here to represent an organ in the body, and I sort of wrapped the fluid-filled baggie around it. And so, yeah, the chicken breast was supported and cushioned by that baggie. Well, that's the way to think of a serosa. It's a fluid-filled membrane. It surrounds and protects various organs in the body. The side of a serosa that sticks to the organ that it's protecting is called the visceral serosa. So this part right here is the visceral serosa. But the other side of the serosa that sticks to the body cavity wall, like my hands in this diagram, that's called the parietal serosa. Well, you find these serosa membranes surrounding and supporting many different organs in the body. For instance, the heart, think of that as the heart now, is surrounded by its own serosa. That serosa is called the pericardium. But what I'm saying in this lecture is the lungs also, now the chicken breast is the lungs, the lungs also are surrounded by one of these serosas, and we call that serosa that surrounds the lungs, we call it the pleura. And yeah, here's the side, this thin black line here is the side of that serosa that attaches to the lungs, so that's the visceral pleura. And this thin black line right here is the side of that serosa that attaches to the wall of the thoracic cavity, so we call that the parietal serosa. Okay, yeah, so that the fluid that fills the, I think I kept saying serosa. Sorry, I should have said pleura. That's the visceral pleura that attaches to the lungs, and the parietal pleura is the side of the pleura that attaches to the thoracic cavity wall. Good, and the liquid that fills the pleura is called the pleural fluid. And so that's a very important liquid because, as I was saying earlier, it helps your lungs slide frictionlessly as you're breathing in and out. There's a disease called pleurisy where, for various reasons, the person is not making enough pleural fluid. And so it becomes very painful for the person to breathe because without that pleural fluid, there's no lubrication for the lungs as they're stretching larger and smaller and the person's breathing in and out. And there's actually another interesting disease that relates to the pleura. The pleura helps the lungs to stay stretched out because remember that the lungs are elastic, and so their natural tendency is to want to do elastic recoil to a very small size, but to function correctly they have to be stretched to a larger size. Well, that pleural fluid also makes essentially kind of a glue to hold the lungs stretched into a larger size. And the pleural fluid, when I say it acts as a glue, it's not as if it's sticky like glue is. Any liquid, even water, can act as a glue if there's no air bubbles in the water. Well, that's what I'm saying. It works also. So with your lungs, if there are no air bubbles in your pleural fluid, the lungs stay stretched out like they're supposed to and you're breathing fine. But if any air bubbles get in there, then the vacuum is broken and the lungs, because of their elastic nature, will suddenly shrink themselves to a smaller size, and then you won't be able to breathe too well. And if that happens to a person, it's called having a pneumothorax. You know, pneumo means lungs, and thorax is in the chest, so it basically means something's going wrong with your lungs there in your thoracic cavity. Now, how would air bubbles get into there? Well, it's typically an injury of some sort. You know, imagine something puncturing the person's chest. Maybe they were stabbed or shot, or maybe they were in a car crash and part of the steering wheel or something broke through their chest. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something puncturing them. If something breaks a person's ribs, the jagged edges of the ribs can sometimes poke holes into the pleura, and that can add air bubbles into there. Yeah, so if air bubbles get in there, the lung will collapse inward because, yeah, like anything elastic, it wants to go to its smallest size, and that's what it would look like. That's what a pneumothorax looks like. It's a collapsed lung. Now, there's one saving grace about it. It's that the two lungs act independently of each other. So if a person has a pneumothorax in one lung, their other lung will still be inflated. Oh yeah, so what do the doctors do about it? Well, the problem is that air has gotten in here and ruined the vacuum, so to speak. And so the doctors basically have these vacuum pumps that they can stick in there and just pull the air out. And so as the air bubbles go out, the lungs get reinflated to their larger size and will eventually just reattach themselves to the pleura there. All right, speaking of breathing problems, if the doctors think a person has a breathing problem, and I'm not talking about necessarily a pneumothorax, it could just be bronchitis or various other type of breathing problems. One way the doctors can assess is that how much lung function the person has lost is doing something called spirometry. And with spirometry, they just have the person breathe in and out, into a tube that's connected to a machine, and the machine, which is called a spirometer, measures the volumes of air the person can breathe in and out, because there are normal average amounts of volumes of air that a person's is supposed to be able to breathe in and out. And so if the person's having some lung disorder, some lung disease, they're going to end up having lower volumes of air that they can breathe in and out. Okay, well, back to this cartoon here showing the pulmonary loop and the systemic loop, and well, you know the story now. In the pulmonary loop, the oxygen enters the blood, and then it eventually flows down in the systemic loop where the oxygen exits the blood to give the cells the oxygen they need for aerobic respiration. And when the cells do their aerobic respiration, the cells generate carbon dioxide, so that enters the blood in the systemic loop, and then eventually flows into the pulmonary loop, and then the CO2 exits the blood there in the pulmonary loop. Well, what I want to talk about here is what causes those gas molecules to enter and exit the blood. What forces, so to speak, makes the oxygen go in or makes the oxygen come out and makes the CO2 come in and CO2 go out. And here's the answer in just one word. It's diffusion. When was this? I don't know. Within the first week or two at the beginning of the semester, I talked about this diffusion concept. It basically means molecules spreading out from each other. The official definition is molecules moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration, but that's just a fancy way of saying molecules spreading out. So imagine you had some green ink and you put a drop of it in water. Well, those ink molecules want to spread out. They want to diffuse. And so they're going to move from their high concentration area here to their low concentration area over there. And yeah, and that is spreading out. Well, it's not just green ink molecules. All molecules, including oxygen molecules and CO2 molecules, just naturally want to diffuse. It's just the natural process that all molecules want to do. And so that's what I'm saying. That's what moves oxygen into your blood and out of your blood, and CO2 out of your blood and into your blood. It's just those molecules are always just diffusing from high concentration areas to low concentration areas. All right, so now let me get back to the respiratory system and fill a little more details in on that. All right, so here we see, let's start off towards the top of the figure in the pulmonary loop there. All right, so in the pulmonary loop, notice the oxygen is diffusing into the blood and the carbon dioxide is diffusing out of the blood. Why does that happen? Oh, darn it, I was in the wrong spot. I guess I'm in the systemic loop. Well, all right, I'll begin with the systemic loop. That's fine. All right, so in the systemic loop, the blood in the arteries of the systemic loop is high oxygen concentration, like that. Why is my, well, maybe I'm in the pulmonary loop. Sorry about this. I guess I am in the pulmonary loop. Sorry about this. I thought I knew this presentation better. Okay, so now we're in the pulmonary loop. There's an alveolus, and here's this blood vessel next to the alveolus. Okay, so when you inspire, you breathe in a high concentration of oxygen into your alveoli. Why is that a high oxygen concentration? Oh, this thing is going wacko. Why is that a high oxygen concentration? Well, the air in the atmosphere is just naturally high in oxygen. It's just one of its natural traits. Go back, you silly thing. It's just one of the natural traits of air that it's high in oxygen. Whereas if you notice the blood here that's flowing to the lungs in the pulmonary loop, that's low oxygen blood. And so as that blood is flowing past the lungs, you have low oxygen blood right next to high oxygen air in the alveoli of the lungs. And so just by diffusion, the oxygen naturally wants to flow from the air in the lungs into the blood. And so, yeah, it's just nothing but oxygen going from high concentration to low concentration. Whereas if you look down here in the systemic loop, the blood that flows through the arteries in the systemic loop is high oxygen concentration because it picked up oxygen from the lungs. But the area around the cells is low oxygen concentration because the cells are constantly gobbling up oxygen for their cellular aerobic respiration. And so, again, it's just diffusion. High concentration of oxygen in the blood, low concentration of oxygen in the tissue fluid around the cells, and so the oxygen just naturally flows out of the blood there in the systemic loop. And let's see if I can get this thing to cooperate this time. There's the oxygen flowing in. This is the pulmonary loop now. Oh, it's not doing it. Okay, well, the CO2s end up at a high concentration in the blood in the pulmonary loop, and so they naturally want to flow out of the pulmonary loop into the alveoli where there's a low CO2 concentration, like you see going on there. And again, it's just flowing from high concentration there in the blood to low CO2 concentration there inside the alveoli. Okay, yeah, sorry for the technical difficulties, but the important point is that it doesn't matter whether it's oxygen going into the blood or oxygen coming out of the blood or CO2 going into the blood or CO2 going out of the blood. It's just diffusion. They're always moving from high to low concentration areas. All right, well, so in those cartoons that I was just showing you of the blood flowing through the loops, let me see if I can get them to show up here again. In these cartoons that I've been showing you, I've just been showing the oxygen as just being inside the blood, and likewise I've just been showing the CO2 as just being kind of dissolved in the blood. And in both cases, those are slightly simplifications. And so what I want to do now is talk a little bit more detailed about exactly how the blood carries the oxygen, and exactly how the blood carries the CO2. Let's start with the oxygen. So to begin with, the oxygen is carried inside the red blood cells of the blood. The oxygen really is not in the plasma, it's not in the white blood cells, it's not in the platelets, it's carried inside the red blood cells. And that's really the only job of red blood cells, is to carry oxygen. But we can be slightly more detailed about it. Inside each red blood cell is this protein called hemoglobin protein, which I'm representing as kind of little blue dots there. And there's actually a lot of hemoglobin protein inside each red blood cell. You don't have to know this number, but somebody estimated about 250 million hemoglobin proteins are inside each and every red blood cell. So think of each red blood cell as just being stuffed to the gills with hemoglobin protein. And the reason that the red blood cells have so much hemoglobin protein is it's actually the hemoglobin protein that carries the oxygen for the red blood cells. Here's a close-up of the hemoglobin protein. Well, you can't really see hemoglobin protein even with a good microscope because it's too small. But if you could see hemoglobin protein, that's what it would look like. Well, notice that each hemoglobin protein has 4 iron ions. A little red ball you see there, and there are iron ions. And the reason why the hemoglobins have iron is iron holds oxygen. So it's actually the iron ions on the hemoglobin proteins inside the red blood cells. That's actually where the oxygen is being carried. Now, why does the iron hold the oxygen? Well, that's just a natural thing. There's a natural attraction between iron and oxygen. That's why things rust. If you put metal things that have iron in them just out in the environment, after, I don't know, a few months or so, they'll get all rusty. That's because the ions on the metal object are binding to oxygen in the air. Anyway, so your body takes advantage of that same attraction between iron and oxygen as a way of holding the oxygen. Here's some O2 molecules. Yeah, they just come in and they just naturally stick to those irons that are part of the hemoglobin protein inside the red blood cell. Oh, and it's kind of an interesting thing, at least I thought it was kind of fascinating. That's why high oxygen blood is red. If you think of rust, which is just iron combined with oxygen in the outside world, like on nails and barbed wire fence and things, rust is kind of reddish colored. And so that's what gives your high oxygen blood its reddish colored also. You're essentially rusting your irons that are part of your hemoglobin molecules when you combine them with oxygen. And that's also why you need to get some oxygen in your oxygen. You need to get some iron in your diet, just to make sure that your hemoglobins have enough iron to hold the oxygens. If you take a vitamin and mineral supplement like I do, if you look at the ingredients list, somewhere on there will tell you, here it is, that you're getting your recommended daily allowance of iron, which I guess is 18 milligrams per day. And that's why you need iron in your diet, to make sure your hemoglobins are able to carry enough oxygen. All right, so how are the oxygens carried? They're carried on iron ions, which are part of hemoglobin protein, which are inside the red blood cells.
This is the end of part 1 of the respiratory system lecture. Now please proceed to part 2.